Thank you all for coming. It is great to see you all here. Let me start for you guys basically with a short introduction round. Julia Schuetze is a project manager for international cybersecurity at cybersecurity policy at Stiftung Neue Verantwortung. For those of you who don't know Stiftung Neue Verantwortung, it is a think tank working on the intersection of technology on the one hand and society on the other hand. When I had her on the phone, I asked her what question leads your research interest, and she said, well, quite early in my career, I have focused on governance methods and comparing different governance methods. And she always asks herself, what can we learn from each other? And after saying that, this might not come as a surprise to you now, but her main focus currently is on EU diplomacy, and she works with the US and Japan on this project. I am very delighted that she doesn't only have the perspective of working in a think tank this evening, but also in her free time. She volunteers at the Open Governance Parliament Civil Society Working Group in Germany, so she also has the perspective of civil society and how the internet shapes civil society and especially questions of human rights. So thank you, welcome. Max Senges is the lead for research partnerships and internet governance at Google in Berlin. He previously worked for Google in California as the head of Google's hardware user research team. And as you can see, he has the perspective of the private sector for both America as well as Germany, but also because he is the lead for research partnerships. He knows how academia, the private sector, internet politics, innovation and culture intersects and how they intersect. And I'm looking forward to your perspective on that. And as if that wasn't enough, parallel to Google, he has worked and collaborated with Vint Cerf, for those of you who don't know him, he's one of the so-called fathers of the internet, and he has worked with him on internet governance and open standards. He's also a visiting scholar at the Stanford Center for Democracy, Development and the Rule of Law, where he researches on democracy in a digitalized world. Thank you for being here tonight, Max, and welcome as well. So now, I'm introducing to you Wolfram von Heynitz. He has the title Head of Cyber Policy Coordination Staff at the German Federal Foreign Office. And when I read this title, I was like, wow, this is a huge title. Then I spoke to him and realized it's not No, I wasn't disappointed at all, but I thought, okay, it is not only a huge title, but it actually represents his responsibility, because what he told me about his job is that obviously we are all surrounded with digitalization processes and the internet, and the internet have changed societies globally. And there are a lot of new phenomena, chances, but also dangers. And obviously some people have to think from a governmental perspective about the new situation and coordinate the actions internationally. And that's basically what he does. He coordinates internationally how to make the internet a safe place and how internet politics can be more coordinated. Before that, he initiated and developed a cyber policy strategy for the Federal Foreign Office. setting its future direction and strategies on cyber policy and cybersecurity. And that's my favorite bit, basically. Because I think it is so interesting, he doesn't only has a background in law, but he also has a background in philosophy. And he started to think about AI from a philosophical point of view back in 1988 with his magister. So he has quite a experienced view on how AI changed, and yeah.
And all my friends from back '88 who continue to work on AI, they work now for Google and are millionaires.
Oh, well.
Just a joke.
So yeah, with you for the next hour, we have an expert on governance perspective, international governance perspective. And well, thank you for sharing your insights, Wolfram, and welcome to the stage as well.
Thanks a lot.
So without further ado, let's start the discussion on internet regulation. And I thought about, well, let's start the discussion not at the current status, but let's jump altogether to the future. So to all of you, the question now. If you think about the best case scenario in 10 years of internet regulation, where do you think, how should it look like, and where do you think we should stand? Yeah, Julia, do you want to start?
All right, so I will dream ahead a little bit. So I would imagine that something we already kind of promised, that we will actually establish an open, free, and secure cyberspace that is governed by the rules of law, has actually, that we, within our governance structure, if it's regulation, if it's, kind of confidence building measures, anything we kind of do, that we have the perspective of fundamental rights, that we balance them better, that we talk about them more openly, and that we create an internet which reflects civil society perspectives better as they do now. So, yeah.
Okay,
maybe we can find mechanisms to get there.
Thank you. So I believe the journey for the system that we want to have in 10 years starts this November, or it actually starts right now. This November, we have the United Nations Internet Governance Forum here in Berlin. It's somewhat similar to Republica, just that it brings the stakeholders from civil society, private sector, and government together in a United Nations setting. It's a very lightweight institution. It's only about 10 people working there, and it actually, importantly, was founded about 15 years ago now, based on the idea that the United Nations, that International Telecommunication Union, should not regulate the internet as in the telephone system and other places, but that a multi-stakeholder system would be more appropriate. And I really think that the meeting this year in Berlin is why I came back from California to Berlin to help Google's participation and contribution to that forum. And I think that actually not only holds the promise that we come up with a good internet governance system that works and is fair and respects human rights, et cetera, but that it is a pilot and a forum to establish better governance on a global scale for all the various topics. Mm-hmm. Because the challenge that we have, I think, is that in today's complex world where you have technological expertise that's needed, you have business expertise that's needed, you have legal expertise that's needed, basically you have political things, civil society perspectives that are needed. It's very, very difficult to just say, oh, okay, let's have everybody in the world, like in a democratic system, vote for a president of the internet and organize it in that democratic way. So what we need is a system where all stakeholders play their respective roles, but that has democratic oversight and that always considers representative perspectives from the citizenry. Basically, there is a tool, deliberative democracy, that I'm working on in Stanford. And I think that's at least the starting point for that vision. Looking forward to discuss more.
Can I just one question for that? So the way, and I'm also involved in the Internet Governance Forum, and I think it's great for exchange, and it's a place where we at least kind of get a sense for what are the problems elsewhere and how are you dealing with them. But for now, it's still a discussion place. So the way it sounded is, do you want to develop this into a rule-making democratic state, or because right now it's just an exchange, like it's great, but it's not a,
So I'm going to pass the ball to Wolfram, because I think we're somewhat in a similar perspective there. It should not be the place where the policies are made. This is the space where all the different parties come together and actually can deliberate and think about solutions rather than complain about each other or have demands and really negotiate, which always creates the situation that you don't want to lose. So, but when you get together in an environment like the IGF, you're actually trying to solve problems together, because that's where everybody benefits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to start with my vision of 10 years, which fits to that, basically, because I think what we have today is not a unified structure of internet governance. And I think that's a good thing. That's what it makes it so exciting. That's why I think it reflects also our fast-changing and diverse world of today, also how complicated our world of today is. So in 10 years, I still think internet governance will still look like a kilt, like a patchwork blanket, basically, but hopefully in more harmonious colors than today, basically. It doesn't have to be all the same colors or the same fabric. I mean, a kilt lives from the difference of the fabrics. There will be big silk patches, rich silk patches by larger companies. There will be a strong layer, basically the government structures. And I hope it will be open at the seams so that other people could attach to it, that there still patches can come together, that it's not a closed shop, that it's still open. And there will be, of course, a lot of multi-fabric, basically very diverse fabric, civil society contributions to it. So it will stay like this. And in this context, that internet governance is not a monoculture or a straightforward process, I think the Internet Governance Forum in the fall has to play an important role, but as a forum for discussion, a forum for try out new ideas, to bring different stakeholder groups into contact to try out things. I don't think it is really the only governance forum, but it is an important part of it. And you also have to distinguish between technical regulations of the internet, where basically you just have to convene a group of people, a group of stakeholders who apply certain standards and norms, and the much more complicated political process, which has to be underlined by a democratic process, and that can only be guaranteed by states. So there will be a role of states, but me as a state representative, we're not claiming we want to govern it all. We want to have the control over the whole thing. We just think we should play an important role.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for all your visions. Let's just talk about the status quo now, or where we are now, because you already mentioned that, I mean, we had quite a few range. You said that something really has to change. You said that it will be slightly different, but the overall structure will still be the same. Could you just, to have the same baseline here, could you tell us how the structure of internet governance, or how internet governance works today, the global perspective?
How many hours do we have? Basically, it is a patchwork already. So you have some very centralized structures. You have the root servers, you have the DNS system as a basically more or less centralized system. Then you have the technical standards, which are basically voted by using them, by basically that companies, that users of the internet subscribe to it and apply it, basically. And then you have a kind of government structure, but this is not straightforward. You have a UN process, but the UN process in itself, it's very complicated. We have a process how to behave between states. That's basically, you could say, the top layer. it's clear that international law applies also in cyberspace. So cyberspace is not something just virtual. Cyberspace also is a kind of our real world where international rules apply. You can't attack somebody in cyberspace like you can't attack somebody in the real world. So there are big differences, but basically the same set of rules apply, but the way they apply is much more complicated. So there are international bodies within the UN context trying to work out how international law applies on cyberspace and what norms of behaviors between states should be applicable in cyberspace. That's a very difficult process because you see the same, well, or different, but same difficulties between states, between different blocs. You have countries like Russia and China who advocate a kind of strict control of governments about the internet, basically simplified, that every state should regulate the net within their own borders. And then you have the group of Western countries mainly, but not only Western countries, who advocate an open internet and say, hey, the great thing about this thing is that it crosses borders, so let's keep it open, let's keep it international, and let's not block it up. But we still need rules for that. You don't attack critical infrastructure, as example, things like that. So let's talk about a set of rules and how to apply that in cyberspace. Then you have another level. You need to work out what rules on data protection, on privacy apply. And that's, for us in Germany, mainly it's regulated on EU level, or we're trying to find standards on EU level. There's also kind of global competition going on between different blocs, between different groups, how to basically apply that. Mm-hmm. And then you have, of course, kind of self-regulations of the certain parties involved, of the big companies, and that plays an important part. But you have to find the right balance between what you want to regulate on an basically international level, what you want to regulate on a regional level, what you want to regulate on a national level, and where actually rules set by the players themselves is the best. You also have kind of forums like the Paris Call, where all these groups come together. The Paris Call has been signed by more than 300 participants, and that includes states, the whole of the EU as example, and large companies like Microsoft, Google, and others. Mm-hmm.
So, to try a much more simplified version, I think that the internet developed really, really nicely and made a lot of people optimistic. When I was like 18, 19 at the verge of the millennium, I thought it can only get better, and democracy is going to win out, and that kind of continued for the early 2000s. But in the last 10 years, I grew darker and darker in my optimism, and I'm really worried. I think we really got ourselves into a pretty significant mess, and the fact that some of the big companies are actually now saying, "Please regulate us," is kind of a backflip, which I think is silly as well. What we have to do is we have to stop complaining and pointing fingers and start to get back on that old track that made the internet really what it is, which is a big collaboration platform. Mm-hmm. So if we start to team up and dissect the problems that we have, a democracy problem, economic capitalism problem, and a problem with human rights and the differences between cultures, then we can actually build individual efforts to address those, and that's exactly where the IGF comes into play. The IGF is a place where you can set the agenda, where you bubble up topics and you say, this is important, and groups find each other, institutions find each other to address those problems. They don't address them in the IGF, they work on their thing, they come back a year later and they report about how it's been progressed. And I think the roles of the different stakeholders is actually not as complex as it sometimes seems that it is. Because, clearly the private sector, to the biggest part, is setting the infrastructure. It's the telcos on the, on the infrastructure level. There's content and platform providers that provide more sophisticated services. right? And then you have the government who is really brokering the negotiation and inviting the right people, setting the rule of law, of course, in the end. And then you have civil society that's there to, really check and make sure that it's a watchdog function and a function to make sure that the public interest is really served. And I think that's what can happen at the IGF. That doesn't mean that the solutions are being produced there, but that's where we get together and where we identify how we want to work together.
Yeah, when I think about the current situation, I would also say I'm very worried when you work in cybersecurity and policy and look at what's happening right now. You need cybersecurity and IT security as like a baseline, and you also need kind of the freedom then to operate and not be surveilled, for example. And what we see now, right now is that states use cyberspace to, keep vulnerabilities so they can increase their law enforcement capabilities and their and staff their surveillance agencies. That's not necessarily helpful in general for IT security, but it's also not helpful for kind of privacy and anonymity of the internet. We see that the states use cyberspace as a military zone. They use them also under the armed conflict and to use offensive means as defense mechanisms. The US is doing that right now, and China and Russia. And I feel a little bit lost in the way that we need a really good different narrative, and we have ideas. There's really good collaboration on building resilience. It's super important for small states. It's very important for businesses to thrive. It's important for us as citizens to be online and enjoy all the good tools that the internet offers. But if you have states that put priority on using cyberspace to defend, to use it as a space of conflict, that's, it's really putting in jeopardy the idea of an open and free internet. And from the kind of talks I see on an international level right now between EU and US and EU and Japan as well, and also when you go to Japan, they are in kind of in a similar state like us in Germany, that we have a defense focus but they're getting pushed. You have to have these offensive capabilities, and you have to make your legislations work that you can have these. You need them, and that's making it. We need a different narrative, and the EU, I think, could have that, but you do have member states in the EU who also do not necessarily would want to push that narrative.
So what could be a different narrative if you're talking about a different narrative?
So I think the different narrative would be to build and work together on building resilience, and IT security and cybersecurity, helping each other out, learning from each other, creating regulations that are effective to create IT security, and there I think all these countries have different approaches right now domestically, so it could be very interesting, to help each other there. But yeah, right now it's not looking too great.
I totally agree on the resilience part. I think that's the key, and that's where we can really help each other. But I also see that there are differences. There is a threat on a state-by-state level. There are state actors or state-sponsored actors, or at least states that allow private actors to operate from their territory to attack or prepare attacks onto other stakeholders, private and state stakeholders. Yes, so that is one part of security, but I don't want to paint the two bleak pictures. It's also defending the right of private citizens. Also, if you don't have privacy in the internet, then also something is wrong. So you have to regulate it. And for all this, it's clear what Max said. The internet is has not been built by states. It's not a state-run organization. The private sector is key. And actually you, the citizens, are key because you use it every day and you contribute to it. So it's a participatory media, basically. And you have to reflect this, and that's why the only reasonable approach to it is what we call a multi-stakeholder approach to internet governments, and it's not that states between each other in a kind of UN group can regulate everything. And that's also the spirit behind the Internet Governance Forum. That's also the spirit why we meet here and why we talk to each other quite frequently, actually.
Mm-hmm. Well, then I might just add, but if the more threatening policies are actually created within the countries, right, then you might need a better multi-stakeholder mechanisms within these countries. And I mean, we have the discussion here in Germany about some regulations, and as civil society and academia, you get lucky if it's leaked, and then you see and get a grasp of a law and a legislation that is planned, and you might be able to throw in your concerns, but that's not multi-stakeholder or participatory as it could be, where you could, when you regulate the internet, or if you use the internet as a space of conflict and you want to do that as a state, then you should maybe include the important stakeholders in this drafting process better somehow.
Do you have ideas on how to do it better in the whole process of including the different stakeholders? If you all agree that a multi-stakeholder model is the favorite one, but you also said now that it needs to be better. What are the ways? How could it be better?
I just can give one example, and that is AI regulation on the European level. That is something that is right now ongoing, and the EU didn't start with the states or with a proposal by the Commission. The first thing, they created an expert group, and the expert now came out with proposals for guidelines, basically, but also for a proposal how to proceed in implementation. And the next step should be basically an outreach process, discussing this with different stakeholders, and then a sector-based approach of trying it out, try and error. And that's actually, I think, a very good principle for internet regulation, because it's risky. Sometimes you must make sure that the risks are tolerable and are within limits, but I think nobody gets it right on the first place. So you have to, probably the better word than try and error is basically constant improvement. You have to improve your regulation constantly, because it's so complicated and the internet is so fast evolving. So they will try it out in 4 different sectors, like transport or medicine or law enforcement also, and then, only then it will be decided what needs to be regulated on EU level, what could be left to member states, and what could be to participants in the net themselves. Google has AI guidelines, other companies have them as well, so what could be left to that? And that you have a hope to find the right balance. So, positive example, which underlines the participatory process which we all aim for.
So thanks for using an example, because I do think it's case by case, issue by issue, and there's some underlying principles that you can apply. But it's not that it always works the same way. It's always different stakeholders. Cybersecurity is completely different from trade, from other topics. And when I first looked at it, I thought, okay, how did it historically evolve on the internet? The Internet Engineering Task Force, the Internet Architecture Board. These are incredibly open forums. And they were obviously really successful in defining how the net works. They have one really significant and fundamental difference from all the problems that we problematized and discussed up here. There are technical problems where it's clear how to optimize. If there is more data flowing on the internet, if you can compare 2 solutions, the engineers choose the one that's more efficient and just works better. And what better is hardly discussed in those technical forums, but it's much clearer than when you have different cultural views on how things are, different views on what should be freedom of expression, where the limits are of that. Those are questions that will be continuously debated. So to come up with solutions is never a final solution, but always a reflection of how the participants in those societies think and want things to be. That's why we discuss quite deeply how identity works on the internet, which is a different question on how privacy works on the internet. Identity is something that you can define more objectively and hence can offer tools for expression and to define how you're being seen. And that is actually a different conversation from data governance, which is much more a resource perspective and how you use data to train certain systems. You know, it always used to be about data protection. Now in the last year, maybe two, it's a lot about data sharing and forcing big platforms to share data. I'd argue that, you know, the balance between the two is actually data governance, is how do you interact and use the resources, and it's not straightforward. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to, you know, be number one, not too much efficiency driven. I think these things need time. When just to share one example that builds on your earlier point on AI, when Google is launching AI-based products, we don't go and go on a big stage and say, now for everybody on the world, here's a new AI thing. That's not how you should launch AI-based products, because you actually need to find out group by group, step by step, how they are working, understand and test them yourselves, and then go grow the user base. And that's how internet governance should also work. There is little pockets of innovation, of experiments. Estonia is one that's quoted for many occasions, because they're a smaller country. They can try out things, and if it works there, then we should pick it up in bigger countries, and it's a normal evolutionary process. It's just that we're all fairly restless and want the solutions to happen in 1, 2, 3 years, and not in 10 years. So thanks for asking the question, what's with that bigger time horizon.
Julia?
Yeah, I would also add that I think it is, we had quite a lot of time now to also try regulations, but what is beneficial to really look now and see, you know, this country did it this way, and also create a little bit more empirical research also on what does this do? Does this work? Could this work better? In which environment does it work? And we have a project called Transatlantic Cyber Forum, and it's looking at like US and Germany, and you know, challenges we both have, and then we deal with them completely differently. And just putting these people in a room and you know, just seeing the discussion on like, oh yeah, you have a legislation for this, or we don't have a legislation for this. Oh, but you have this thing. And one example is, a positive example that evolved from that was US for quite some time has a vulnerability equity process, which kind of rates when a vulnerability should be kept and used for law enforcement reasons, and when it should be disclosed to the company and patched. And we don't have that, although Germany now also uses vulnerabilities. And with that group, though, we thought, okay, well, the US has one, but then there's research here, and in this country, there's also ideas for that. So let's get them all together and think about what could be the ideal one, and what if we do it more this way? What effect does this have? And creating policies that way is super helpful. And I really like Japan for that, because Japanese officials came here last year so often, and just to ask, well, how do you do this? And then they go to another country, how do you do this? And then they go back and like, okay, because I think for us, this makes sense, and this seems to work in this country, but and then we pick this from this other country, and this is how they fastly build now their cybersecurity architecture and regulations before the Tokyo 2020. It's a really good example of how cyber diplomacy can also work on, like, you know, just going out there and seeing what's happening.
You can believe me, I travel a lot, unfortunately, but you have a lot of exchange. But you also have to see that there are different models in the world, how you want to regulate it. Give you one example, which is the Network Enforcement Act, basically the NetzDG in German. So this law basically tries to fight against hate speech and certain crimes which are illegal if you would do it in a normal paper or in a non-cyber environment, but they should also be punishable or forbidden inside the net. So the rule is the same offline and online. That's basically something, an international standard. But how you implement it is different. So in the internet, we agree the main responsibility lies with the providers, with companies like Google, like Twitter, like Facebook, etc. But you need to set the rules how, or you need to basically, I try to avoid the word enforce, but I don't have a better word right now, so try to enforce that if somebody complains about something, that these companies who are powerful institutions who sometimes don't have even a legal representative inside Europe react in time. And that's the purpose of that NetDG network enforcement law as example. And it works. And in the process it has been improved. The first version was probably not as good as the last version, and the last version, the actual version, wouldn't be the last version. It will constantly improve. But at the same time, you see other countries pick this law up and say, oh, that's great. Now we have a tool how to basically banish criticism of our president in the internet. And we said, oh, no, that's not what we meant, basically. So you have to be careful how your own laws transfer into a different context. So you need to have these conversations, but you need to have a value-based conversation, and you need to be quite clear what are your values, what your values are that you try to defend, and how you do it in a smart way, and who are your partners and who aren't your partners.
Okay, that was a good thing for me. So what would you say are the values for internet governance that are important?
Luckily, that was a pretty hot debate about 2012 to 2014, and there was a conference in Brazil, Net Mundial, that ended a whole series of each bigger institution, the OECD, the EU, Google. We all came up with what we thought the internet governance principles should be. And Net Mundial was an international gathering where the Net Mundial principles were established. They're not as well known and spread as you'd expect these days. But surprisingly, it's 5 years ago, so we take the occasion of this year's Internet Governance Forum to reignite them. And it is access to process, each stakeholder in their respective roles. It's really a fairly high level, as you would expect. Rules of the game as to how to participate in that big collaboration that is the internet.
Could you give an example for it, please?
Well, as said, it is really that all relevant processes have to be transparent and they have to be open for participation by all stakeholders. I think that's the most important one.
I think all of you said that two values, or that I picked up two values, are open and free internet, and then that we have an open and free internet in the future as well. Could you tell us here, what open and free means in this world we are standing now for you?
Open and free, first of all, means that you're not I would include secure, because secure is the first thing before you have, because you need to be free from attacks, basically. That's one thing you don't want. If you become more and more dependent on the technology, and we became more dependent on the internet, you have to safeguard that it's used in a secure way. And then the openness means that it's still basically, come back to the value question. I know the Net Mundial values, and you can define it that way, but for me, always a good guide is the basic law, because I think we don't need other values online than we need offline, so I always go to that. We have to defend human dignity, we have to defend freedom of speech, values like that, and that defines for me an open internet. And I would add one thing, what I also want to safeguard is the openness in a commercial economic sense, that new players have access to it, that innovation has a chance in the internet and a room in the internet. So that I would add to these more human rights-based values, but these are of course at minimum more important, or as much important as the other values.
Yeah.
I'd say the open bit is based on open standards on the technical side, and on Popper's conception of an open society as a objective and ground constitution. And the free is mostly related to the freedom of expression and freedom to move as in a democratic country.
Julia, do you? Okay.
So I wanted to, if I may, come back to Wolfram's point, because I don't expect you to pity Google in its role, but I would like you to take a short thought experiment and put yourself in our shoes when it comes to government requests, right, of access to information. Do you just want us to follow the American rules? Do you want us to follow the German rules? Do you want us to follow the rules in Tajikistan or any other country that you choose? It's not easy to basically operate on a global scale as a multinational company, and if there is no United Nations kind of like international agreement to decide whether something is freedom of expression in an individual country, there is sort of a Western perspective on these kind of things, and there are many, many other perspectives and other cultures that we'll have to take into consideration. That is just to say, it's not as easy as to say, Google is not behaving. Sometimes you think we might be behaving well, right, when we push back on government requests from certain countries. Sometimes you think we should behave better and comply with government requests from another country. So all I'm saying is that for us, these international rulemaking conversations are incredibly important, and I think for the cosmopolitan ideal that the internet bears, that we are one people and that we can take this planet forward together, it's the only way to go forward. And we're really fragmenting the space and losing ourselves in a balkanized conversation where some people think they know better what's good for the world than others. I think it's really important to have that conversation together. And I explicitly include our fellow humans in the more eastern countries, where if we let the polarization that I see starting in the last couple of months or years continue, we're not going to end up in a better place. We're going to end up in a place that's closer to the 60s, 70s than to the 90s and early 2000s.
Just want to add one sentence to it, and that's where the EU, I think, has an important role for us, because we as Germany are too small to set rules, but the EU has a chance. We're like-minded countries. We basically share the basic set of values, even if we disagree on a lot of points, but in the basic points we agree on values. And only if we agree on that, on this basis, we can basically expect to shape global rules. So we need the EU for that.
Mm-hmm. Julia, do you want to say something?
Yeah, also only shortly, when you said that NetzDG works, like I think we, in any kind of regulation, we should ask us for whom, right? Like, for whom does it work right now? and for that example, and also others, I would say, well, first of all, for the moderators, and if you've seen the cleaners, then you know what I mean. But people who have to see these hate posts and whatever, for them, those things, it doesn't work for them at all. Like they're not protected, and they have to do this work. And so I would also be very careful with it works, and I would want to see an analysis done for whom and what perspective, So.
And do you have an idea on how it could be better?
Well, I think, in general, looking at a regulation from these different perspectives and having a goal in mind helps. I think I would start there. Have a goal in mind, right? Like if you say you actually have a strategy, in Germany we have a strategy for cybersecurity, and it's built, we want to have cybersecurity in society, for businesses, and for the state. And then you create legislations, and you take actions that are not in line with the strategy. Then stick to the strategy and really think through. And every time you create a legislation, think about, is this actually our goal? Is our goal to get there? And I think that is, just to say with Japan, for example, they have a clear vision of the society 5.0. It's a crazy vision, but every single legislation, every step they're taking and every problems they're identifying and where they're realizing they're on our vulnerabilities, we haven't gotten this right yet, they're on this path. So like, you will always, get sidetracked maybe by, hey, we should defend and we should use this. Oh, well, but we actually want to get there. So if we do this, is this getting us too much off the path? So I think there the EU should be really strong in their narrative, in their goal setting, and Germany can be louder. I'm missing, there are lots of other member states that are out there for cybersecurity and pushing their view, and they're not necessarily with this defense sense in mind. So in
your views,
I would say
what could be Germany could be louder, but what could be the louder voices, or what could be the goals? If you say, for example, Japan, and also I said you always have the question in mind, what can we learn from each other? And now you said, well, we can learn from Japan, for example, to have a clearer goal. And what could be a goal like that for Germany? Do you have?
Well, I don't have one specifically for Germany because I think Germany, I don't care who exactly does it. I think it's a question of substance. As, by the way, if you like philosophy, the German philosopher Habermas has defined, you have the forceless force of the better argument, right? That's how it should be. We should be sitting together, define the problem, and then figure out how we solve it. And that basically, if you ask me where I see very concrete needs for improvement, said Habermas actually wrote a piece or gave a speech in 2006 where he said, the internet, I don't really like it. I'm not sure it really has a future, that kind of thing. And back then I was like, he's getting old. But when you look at the arguments now, what he's saying is what's happening on the internet, everybody is bubbling at the same time. And we might have great freedom of expression, but what we don't have is a structured discourse where, the better arguments win. In the moment, the louder arguments win, and those are most likely not the best ones. So I think what we should focus on as a net community, as a community as a whole, is what Steinmeier said. I was actually really surprised, and I'm quite supportive, to democratize and to develop a better debating culture in the internet and to develop the tools to do that. And one obvious company comes to mind that could have done a great job in helping us do that, but I think we can still do it. Another organization that's not a company, I think will play an even more important role than it already does, and that is Wikipedia. I think negotiating what the ground truth is, what we accept as the objective thing that we believe together should be negotiated in public, and Wikipedia is great for that. And to build on Wolfram's earlier point with AI, I think people are a bit too focused on more abstract the AI superpowers, I would call it. I think it's much closer to home. It's about how coaching, how the technologies that influence our daily lives are structured and how they work, and to understand that and to bring transparency in a conversation about AI-enabled coaching, like what is my free will and how to avoid being hacked, as Harari says. Those are really, really good questions.
Okay.
I can't top quoting the German president and Habermas, but I maybe try it by quoting ourselves. So the goals of German policy in the EU and globally is to create or to safeguard an open, free, and secure internet. But we already said this.
You just said that there should be more debate, and I would like to take the last couple of minutes for the audience to ask questions. If you have questions, which I am sure everyone has questions.
And I take the commercial break for another advertisement on the Internet Governance Forum. We need to coordinate those workshops on intgov.org. You can see what proposals came in. The big topics are all there. You can contact the people and start to get involved.
Okay, first question.
Hello, my name is Clemens Holtmann. You all opted for like a multi-stakeholder approach, so including the companies. We have a similar situation now in Germany with the car industry, where the car industry is actually quite involved into policymaking, and now a lot of people see this actually as part of the problem. So in how far should companies, private companies like Google, Facebook, actually be involved in this policymaking?
Okay, before we answer it, let's take another question.
I was just going to say, like, or maybe say something that also relates to what he has said. I mean, like, I've visited a couple of Eurodics, Internet Governance Forum meetings, etc., and my takeaway from it was actually that the Internet governance in the last 15 years has actually not been very efficient and has not been very effective, and that the situation that we're in with a lot of multitude, different levels of negative fallout when it comes to privacy, when it comes to security, etc., is also a reason of a regulatory vacuum that we have experienced within the last 15 years. So I'd be very interested to hear, and I think like for the last 3 years, we have had a turnaround to a more conservative, not multi-stakeholder policy, but that wants to be more pragmatic and wants to be more efficient and wants to be more problem-determined instead. So I would like to hear what your take on it is, because like that was I looked at internet governance very closely, and that was my impression that everything has changed within the last 5 years, if not 3 years.
Okay, thank you. Let's start with the first question.
I have a short answer to both. First question, I think multi-stakeholder means multi-stakeholder. It doesn't mean government and companies. It means really multi-stakeholders. And luckily we have a great, when it comes to internet, we have a great civil society scene in Germany, and we have the same on European level with a lot of involvement. I don't want to go into the recent legislative proposals or acts by the EU particularly, but there have been demonstrations right here on the street in the city center of Berlin. There's a lot of debate ongoing, so there is a lot of civil society engagement. It's also behind the scene, it's the same. Well-organized groups, well-organized lobbying from all parts. And I think that's the way it should be. It should be open for everybody, for stakeholders. That means more than companies. On the second questions, yes, I share your impression. I also think there's room for improvement in internet governance. It's a bit, as Max pointed out, it's a victim of the history, basically. It developed out of a kind of more smaller. It's basically a victim of its own success, because internet and the importance of internet developed so fast that basically the formats made me in the need of improvement. And there are a lot of discussions going on. We had Andrew Sullivan, the head of the ISOC, the Internet Society, here a couple of weeks. He came up with some proposals. I know at the UN there's a process. Secretary General Guterres of the UN is heavily interested in improving it. It will be part of the proposals of this high-level panel that he put in place, how to basically coordinate intergovernance better on this level. But it has to be a careful process, because you want to safeguard at the same time what's good on this, and particularly this participatory process where everybody has a say, where it's not left to basically big and powerful institutions or companies, basically.
So very briefly, it's about the transparency, right? It's one thing to have industry participants work with policymakers, and then we live with those results. It's another if it's an open debate, and that's again part of those internet governance principles. It's also true that the Internet Governance Forum in particular, both the European, the German, and the international institutions are not success stories in terms of impact. I think they need significant reform, but what they need most importantly, they need our attention and they need our work to go there. It's the right instrument to come up with solutions that actually work, and I'm going to come back to Andrew Sullivan, who is really a great thinker about all of this, ran the Internet Architecture Board for a long time, so this guy really knows from the substance of technology as well as from his philosophy PhD what he's talking about. So check him out. He has a post on the internet, it's all carrots and no sticks. And when I asked him, like, what did he learn from the technical environment and how that works, he said it's actually fascinating. There is a ground rule, and that is your network, your rules. So every on the packet switching, like backbone side, everybody decides how they handle their servers. There's no international law or anything. Like these are fundamentals, the fundamental services that make all of our great internet things happen. And he explained that the whole system only works basically by good reputation and by the right incentive systems. And that's what we have to come up with. We have to come up with a system that works as little as possible with the post-fact, sanctions of bad behavior and motivate as much good behavior and set the right incentives. And that's not easy to do.
Julia, you have the last word for 10 or 20 seconds.
Just my quick take on that. I mean, the challenge is, if you, on the internet governance level, is that states are very well connected through diplomatic means. Multinational companies have that, but civil society is not as well organized and connected. So you have to enable that, and you have to find good formats that are not just panels. You have to find productive formats to get civil society across countries together so they can create a voice. We don't have that in Europe yet. Yeah, so.
Okay, that was a really nice closing sentence. Thank you all for being here, you as well as you, and have a good evening.
TL.